Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. Welcome to the launch of the Centre for Circular Metals as part of the NICER launch. And you're all very welcome to be here today. My name is Mark Miodownik. I'm the UCL Professor of Materials and Society, and I am one of the co-Is in this project, which is led by Professor Fan, and I will introduce him and the other co-Is in a minute. What do I want to say? Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks for joining us. We're really excited about this centre. We think it's absolutely essential. We're really glad that UKRI and the British government have really decided that, the UK is going to be the first to be fully circular in metals. And that is our ambition. And it is an achievable ambition. And we are going to set out today how we are going to get there. And of course, we can't do it on our own. We need you all. We need the whole community, but it's also a global enterprise. And we are under no illusions that if we do this just insularly in the UK, we will not achieve our aim. I wanted to say a little bit about the history of materials, because I'm a professor of materials and society. And that means that not only do I do research on materials, researched for new materials, but also look at the history of materials and communicate that to the public. Because materials really are the heart of everything that we do in civilization. They're where civilization comes from. It's no accident that the ages of civilization are named after materials. We have the Stone Age, and then we had, well, the Glue Age. People don't really talk about the Glue Age, but glues were incredibly important. And we had an age of textiles, and we had an age of metals, starting with coppers, and moving through to bronzes and finally steels, and then aluminium. And I'm sort of obviously kind of shortcutting a lot of the materials developments, but each one of those materials, as it comes along, changes society, changes what's possible. It makes architecture possible, makes travel possible, allows us to clothe ourselves, keep warm, inhabit different parts of this wonderful world. This is the journey we're on with this centre, this NICER program, because if you look at the centres, they are all focused on one of those key materials categories, right? You've got the glues, but actually that has kind of transported itself into chemicals. And we have a centre for chemicals. We've got the textiles. We've got the ceramics and the concretes and the cementatious materials. And we've got metals. And in fact, you'll notice there are two centres for metals. One is the technical metals, so-called, which in a way started earlier with things like gold and copper and so on. And then come along the epochal metal that changed industry. And in fact, the Romans were the first really to make steel an industrial material and forged, hundreds of years of their civilization on being able to industrialize steel. And that was echoed throughout the world. It's not quite clear why the Bronze Age gave way to the metal of steel, because steel is much more difficult to make than bronze, but it's probably to do with material shortages. And that's what we face today. We face not so much shortages, but this environmental catastrophe that is involved in the energy and the CO2 production of making steel and aluminium, but all the other materials too. They're a big part of CO2 emissions globally. And that is the focus of today's event. So how are we going to get going on this? We are the Circular for Circular Metals. We're focusing on the two most impactful high volume structural metals, which are aluminium and steel. And we're going to work in close collaboration with the other centres, and including the technical metal centres, because obviously there's a lot of overlap. And our partners will overlap too, and that's the great thing. We're a collaboration between three universities: Brunel, Warwick, and UCL. And we launched our centre on the 10th of May. And this is a second launch, really to knit us together, but also for those who couldn't make the first launch. And if you want to go to our website and join our mailing list, please go to www.circularmetal.co.uk. And we're open for business. Industry, academic partners, communities, globally, we want you to get in contact with us. We want to work with you. And we also relish, of course, working with the other centres. Now, we're going to hear in a minute from the PI and director of the Institute, Professor Fan. We're also going to hear from Professor Paul Monks, the Chief Scientific Advisor to Bayes. We're going to hear from, sorry, let me just lost my place there. We're going to hear from, Professor Dame Julia King. We're going to hear from Chris McDonald, CEO of Materials Processing Institute. And we're going to hear from the other co-Is, Professor Bleichwitz, Fan, Cantor, Godsell, Scammons, Davis, and Harrison. And I am also here as your chair. So there we are. I hope you've got the sense of where we're coming from, what we're doing. We understand the history, we understand the future. What is this future that we're moving towards? It's a circular future. So could we have the next slide, please? Yes, so before we start the event properly, I'd just like to say some housekeeping for those of you who haven't been attending these events throughout the week. So this event is being recorded and it will be accessible on the website in a few days. We invite you very much to share your comments and questions in the Q&A function, and we will be responding to them both on the Q&A function and between events. Well, at the end of the first set of talks, we're going to have a Q&A for those of you who want to put questions to us directly there, and we will respond to those. So please either put them in the chat, in which case we'll get them at the end, or we'll answer them during the chat. So that is it. Without further ado, he says, just checking that my notes are correct for this. Housekeeping, yes. So it is without further ado. That was a bit of ado. I would like to say that these presentations you're about to see were pre-recorded, and the first presentation will be from Professor Fan. Now, he is director of BCAST, which is a center that specializes in understanding the research on casting metals and at Brunel University. And he is going to talk to us about the project, about this new center. So I'm going to hand over now to Professor Fan.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome all the friends from far away. And my name is Zhongyu Fan, as Mark introduced. I'm the PI, the principal investigator of Circular Metal. Circular Metal is a program, collaborative program between Brunel University, UCL, and Warwick universities. And it's funded by UKRI and through the NICER program. And you can see at top here is our logo here. The full name, UKRI Interdisciplinary Center for Circular Economy, for Circular Metals. And for short, we got a short name called Circular Metals. And just for your information, if you use full name, it's Circular Metals. And it's just short name, one word, Circular Metal without S. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'll give you a very brief introduction. Thank you very much for all the previous speakers, Julia, Nick, and Fiona, to set up the background for this center here. Can you go forward? Okay. Resource consumption here, okay. The Earth has been there for 4.5 billion years. And human being arrived on this planet only about 200,000 years ago. But human being has made a big splash on this planet. And particularly last 200 years after Industrial Revolution, and the resource consumption changed from circular manner to a more linear manner. And more important, after Second World War, resource consumption becoming exponential. And as you can see from this diagram here, after 1945, there's an exponential growth of resource consumption. which coupled with fast GDP growth and followed by some degree of increase of populations. Okay, so we need to see why we are doing this. Can I have next slide? This linear resource flow and is causing us big problems here now. And as the previous speakers already mentioned here, for a long time, the planet we are living in is almost circular. And in the last 200 years, we take huge amount of resource from Earth and to fuel our economy by making different things. After usage, most of them becoming waste and deposited back to the planet. So what we are doing, basically, we are undermining the planet and as an ecosystem. The ecosystem is shrinking by size, by volume, and our local economy, human economy is growing. So there's a head-on collision between the shrinking nature and our human economy. The consequence of this is our global ecosystem is shrinking and losing its power to sustain life. The next slide, the deeper reason for this is how we position ourselves to nature. For a long time, we arrived on this planet, we are feared of nature, so we worship nature. And after the Industrial Revolution, we start to change our mind. We think we position ourselves as master of nature, and our aim is to conquer nature. That's how we develop into this linear way of thinking, linear way of economy. We make, we use, we deposit. Regardless of the nature's ability to regenerate, and regardless of the need for future generations. Next slide. Now I'll take an example. Most of you may be familiar with steelmaking process. This is a typical example of linear technology as an outcome of linear way of thinking here. And to start with, you have mineral mining and processing and utilizing carbon to reduce iron oxide to produce liquid iron, which is quite often called pig iron. The pig iron, because you use the carbon to reduce, the pig iron saturated with carbon, about a few % of carbon there. And it's very brittle and much less usage. So in order to get rid of carbon, what we do, we blow oxygen into the liquid metal. That's very famous, the oxygen converter, and they invented in this country, Sheffield, some 200 years ago. Okay. With this process, the oxygen is reducing the carbon inside the iron, liquid iron, but the oxygen contents in the iron is increased. And then what do we do next? We use deoxidation process to put in aluminum or magnesium in to reduce our oxygen contents. But the consequence is we got more oxide inside. They are normal nanoparticles, very difficult to get rid of. So now we're going into the next stage called refining process. The refining process, we also learned the steelmaking process in universities. And there was over 100 different types of techniques to achieve refining of liquid iron, liquid steel. So you can see the problem. It's a linear way of thinking. We try to resolve one problem, but at the same time, it creates a bigger problem for next stage to resolve. Of course, in the future, of course, we need to rethink how we do our science and technology and change our way of thinking. Next slide. Circular economy is just very recently, last 5-6 years, the circular economy research becoming very, very popular. And there's a number of publications increasing exponentially here, which promise to provide a solution to our unsustainable world, okay? we are living in. So circular economy, by and large, is aiming at rapidly to reduce or eliminate extraction of raw materials or production of waste here. And next slide. But in general sense, in broader sense, circular economy goes well beyond economy, and which first thing is philosophy, which defines our position in nature. And as I mentioned before, we position ourselves as master of nature and the linear economy. And circular economy, we should position ourselves as friends of nature. Of course, it's an economy. With this circular economy, all the economic activities has to be bounded by the nature's ability to regenerate. And in research, for the research community, circular economy means we offers us a great opportunity to rethink our science technology, how we develop our science, how we employ our technology as well. And for government, and very importantly, without the strong government innovation, it will be difficult to achieve circular economy. And the transition from linear to circular cannot be achieved without a strong government innovation, which roughly is old terms called visible hand versus invisible hand, which is free market economy. And because free market economy, the whole goal is to enlarge profit. But under circular economy, the objective is to protect the environment and to make the economical development more sustainable. And of course, manufacturing, we need to design products to be high quality and long-lasting to a society, which means a harmonic society which cherishes equality, diversity, and inclusivity. So for future generation, circular economy means a better planet. Of course, there's a lot more. Next slide. Now, circular economy as a research discipline, it just started not very long ago. All these concepts might be in different forms for a long time. And here I just listed 5 very basic principles. And it sounds very complicated, but in terms of very basic principle, it's easy to understand. And the first principle is live in harmony with nature. And as I already said, we need to position ourselves as friends of nature, not masters of nature. The second principle is waste as resource. And all materials, products, and need to flow in a closed loop. Resilience through diversity. So this is a wider sense. This applies to everything. And it's scientific world, and it's a biosystem, is a system with multiple components and more resilient to challenges, to changes. We need to use energy from renewable source. And of course, we need to think in a systemic manner and a holistic thinking rather than is a linear economy, we think a single factor. And next one. And our long-term vision and for our center here, based on the circular economy principles, and we aim to achieve full metal circulation. And under full metal circulation, the global demand for metals is met by secondary metals through reuse, reduce, reuse, remanufacture, recycle, and recovery. Of course, this means no more mining and no more metal extraction. Next one. Circular metal, our strategy in our research is we aim to deliver full metal circulation through closing loop, narrowing the loop, and slow down the loop here. And what I'm showing here, through these 3 approaches, we have set up a number of research areas which is shown by the circles around the metal flow here, and which including circular alloys and circular technology and circular macroeconomics, circular pricing and policy, and circular society. Of course, we should also include circular supply chain, circular business models, and circular product design. So these are interdisciplinary research areas, and so much needs to be covered. And the next one, but we only have 4.3 million pounds to start. We are lucky to have this starting point, but we cannot do everything as we set up in these areas. So what do? We set up projects in specific strategically important areas to reflect the intertwining and 5 socio-economic facilitators and 5 technological enablers, as shown here. As technology enablers include reduce, reuse, remanufacture, recycle, and recovery. And socio-economic facilitators, which including design principles and business models and a sustainable supply chain, macroeconomics, secular policy, and secular pricing. Of course, we need to have secular society. Next one. I have here, just very quickly to illustrate, we have 2 examples to illustrate our ideology to do research here. The first one is secular alloys, okay, and which is a typical example of secular approach to the future alloys. And historically, all the metallic alloys is developed by a very much fixed way. We select a metal, which normally we purify the metal, and then we add some other elements to improve the mechanical or physical performance of the alloys. By doing this, and also through free market economy, and everybody want to have their own alloys, minor changes of composition, processing conditions will lead to different grades. So we end up with thousands of grades of metallic materials around the whole world. And these metallic grades normally are not resilient to changes. And for example, metals theoretically supposed to be recycled infinitely. However, in reality, the metallic alloys cannot be recycled directly. For example, aluminum alloy, and when you recycle, the mechanical performance is very much degraded. You have to do a lot of treatment and processing before they achieve better performance here. So the future alloys, and of course, need to have higher performance. I mean, higher performance, we are not talking about 10%, 20% increase, and it should be orders of magnitude higher performance. And they should be repeatedly recyclable and service much longer. Not only have one life, they can have many lives, okay? And in our research, we are searching for a specific multi-principal elements composition space. Multi-components here with me, it's not 5 or 6. We're talking about 10, 20, 30 elements. There's no principal elements. They're all equally important here. And by doing this, in the future, we only have very few grades of high performance materials. Next one. Next one, I want to see, okay, what's our idea about the future? In the future, how are we going to use metallic materials here? And the circular economy, and metals being extracted and being made into components, and components put into specific devices for applications. And after usage or breaking or damage the metallic components, and we throw away or recycled here. That's how we treat metallic materials, metallic components here. One fact we need to bear in mind, metals are similar to human being. They get tired, so-called fatigued. And after prolonged service, metallic components get fatigued. But we never ask how they feel and how they perform. Is any need for recovery after fatigue? And in the future, we aim to develop similar to the National Health Service in the UK, NHS. We try to develop a mental health service called MHS, and which to change our way to use metals from a slavery approach to a partnership. a partnership means we look after metals and they can serve better our purpose, okay? So the metallic metal health service, which include, we will develop component health record and regular performance monitoring and regular rejuvenation treatments like human being. We have, after working for a while, we have regular food, drink, and sleep. And metal components should be treated a similar way. Metal clinic for minor damages, and also we develop hospitals for serving metal components with have major damage, okay? By doing this, the metallic components, once being made, they can be utilized many times, many lives, and a much longer life. And if a person work continuously without food or drink, we may not even last few days. If we have regular health service and we live for 100 years. The similar metallic components, if we look after through MHS, they should be lasting much longer. Next one, last one. So we are lucky in a place to have circular metal program. And we're very grateful for the funding, and we are very grateful for the industrial input as well. But what we can do is very little here, and we need to deliver first mass circulation. We need everybody. We need every stakeholders. We need all sort of actors to participate in our program. So we welcome you to join us for a long journey ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Fan. And now we're going to, just to remind everyone who's joined us late, we're going to take questions at the end. We're going through a series of pre-recorded presentations that came from our first launch earlier in May. I'm going to now queue up Professor Dame Julia King. She is chair of the Adaptation Committee of Climate Change. She is chair of the Adaptation Committee of the Climate Change Committee of the UK Parliament, and also chair of the Carbon Trust. And she is going to talk briefly about the climate change problem we are facing. Over to you, Dame Julia King.
Congratulations on the opening of the Circular Metals Centre. This is both a critical and a timely initiative. It's critical, one, because we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions globally to net zero between 2050 and 2070 if we are to keep global temperature rise to below 2 degrees and ideally to closer to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. And we should remember, and it's rather alarming, that we're already at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels on average today. To meet net zero, we're going to need lots of new infrastructure like zero carbon renewable energy through offshore wind farms and electric vehicles. Infrastructure like this needs lots more materials such as steel, aluminium, and other metals and alloys. But we know that metal production, mining and refining is environmentally damaging, energy intensive, and a major greenhouse gas emitter. Currently, steel production accounts for something like 10 to 15% of global carbon dioxide. So we need more of these materials with less damage. And that brings me on to the second reason why this is critical, because we need more of these materials. We have just under 1 billion cars in the world today. By 2050, we'll have seen population growth, and the developing world will have seen its GDP grow and will be aspiring for the things that we take for granted today. We could have 2 to 3 billion cars, and that's just one example. But of course, we can't just go on extracting more resources from our planet and creating more waste. So a big part of the answer to both of these issues is the circular economy, the reuse, repurpose, remake, and recycle. And metals are great candidates for this, but it's pretty shocking that we currently only recycle about 50% of steel, and then we take it back through energy-intensive refining processes. How do we move on to not only recycling 100%, but actually to reusing and repurposing, not just recycling? And the low carbon economy itself brings new challenges. Some of the critical ingredients are going to be those batteries, electric motors, fuel cells, electrolyzers. All of these rely on some of the less common metals, such as cobalt, lithium, rare earths, platinum, iridium. It's going to be absolutely essential that we use these again and again if we're going to be able to deliver the electrification that enables and underpins achieving net zero globally. I haven't mentioned timely yet. Timely, of course, because of the urgency of delivering net zero, but also timely because there are some new technologies around that can really make a difference if we use them effectively. Digitalization and digital twins will enable us to know exactly what materials go into everything we make. Traceability and recoverability can be supported by blockchain. Big data will enable all of these technologies and lead to better materials design and design for reuse, remanufacture, and recovery. So I'm looking forward to my next electric car having a sticker on it that says, the lithium in this battery is appearing for the 15th time, like some kind of lucky lottery ball. And you, I hope, are going to be part of making this a reality. This is a hugely important challenge, so the very best of luck with it, and many congratulations again on the launch of the Circular Metals Centre.
Thank you very much, Professor Dame Julia King. And just for those joining us late, this is the launch of the Centre for Circular Metal. Please do go to our website, which is www.circularmetal.co.uk, and join our research community. We are open for business. You are now viewing a series of pre-recorded videos from different stakeholders and partners of ours, making the case for what we're setting out to do and why it's important. And next up is Professor Paul Monks, Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Government's Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, BEIS. And he's going to talk about the importance of the circular economy to BEIS and to the government. Over to you, Professor Monks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for inviting me to the launch of this centre tomorrow and to give a department perspective from a chief scientist in a government department, that thinks the circular economy and metals are incredibly important. So I'm going to go out a little bit. I heard the last presentation. I'm going to go out a little bit and go out from where we start on this and kind of head back into the circular economy and metals a little bit more. For us, one of the biggest challenges that society faces over the next period of time is the challenge put by net zero. And for those of you who don't know, in 2008, the UK was one of the first governments in the world to set an ambitious goal for the reduction of greenhouse gases, and that was being modified more recently, and we've legislated to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050, which is essentially a 100% reduction compared to 1990 levels. And that's very much embodied in something called the Climate Change Act. But also we issue a series of carbon budgets, and we're just about release a sixth carbon budget, which I'll get to in a moment. They're also very much part of the international effort as part of the Paris Agreement and the COPs. And of course, we'll be hosting COP26 in Glasgow later this year. And we've recently just published our what's called nationally determined contribution, which is a very ambitious level for the reduction of those greenhouse gases. As I said, we've got the sixth carbon budget, which has promised to reduce by 78% the carbon emissions by 2035. And I think that really, in some sense, is why am I talking about that? Because this frames this question of the circular economy. Because we're going to need low carbon energy supplies, we're going to need low carbon solutions, we're going to need less carbon intensive activities. We're also going to be able to, it's going to be important that we reduce agriculture as well, or change the way that we do agricultural emissions at least anyway. So to Carbon Budget 6, this is just one of the pathways from the recent reports, and I know you had some very eminent speakers who know a lot about this very early today, but there are different types of pathways to that net zero. But I think there's two elements that are in that long list of 6 things on the right there. We need to reduce demand, and that's for electronics and vehicles and the like, but also we need to improve our resource and material efficiency. And as you can see, they are important elements in achieving net zero in this balanced pathway by 2050, as well as an array of other low carbon solutions as well. So really this demand and resource and material efficiency is absolutely critical and central to the vision of net zero. I think you've had this already, but we've just, as a department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, produced this industrial decarbonisation strategy, which really talks to the heart of this. That talks to these questions around industrial efficiency and material substitution and the support of resource efficiency and the circular economy model, including that increasing of reuse, repair and remanufacturing. That moving away from that linear model, I think, is important. One thing I think is always very important to think about when we talk about net zero, when you talk about the circular economy, we've not got to imagine this is solely a technocratic solution that can be reached by just solely deploying technology. In the Carbon Budget 6 produced by the Climate Change Committee, who advised the government on this, they made the point really strongly that you've got to get the societal and behavioural pathways to net zero working together. And that is very much in some of the issues around the circular economy and metals and recycling. You've got to choose products that last longer, but also you've got to choose products that can be designed to recycle. And that's a real challenge in when you're trying to drive efficiency as well as reusability at the same time. So I think as you sit here today and you think about some of the technological solutions that you'll be thinking about in the centre, I challenge you also to think a little bit about the behavioural wrapper that goes around this and the way that we're also going to need to change our behaviour to meet net zero. There's no doubt that science is a critical part of this. And I take this from a recent report that we as a department wrote. Beyond the immediate imperative to overcome COVID-19, the greatest challenge facing the UK and the world is that of decarbonising our economies and building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And for me, that brings us to the paradigms of sustainable net zero, understanding about critical materials, security, supply and recycling, that end-to-end approach of looking at that. On the right-hand side is a periodic table scaled by the availability of the elements on Earth, showing that we've got an issue around critical materials and the role that science is going to have to play, but also the importance of recycling and security supply in that. We've also got to treat this as a resilient net zero. We'll make challenges, we'll make changes as we go along, but also it's a systems of systems approach this. You need a systems approach to this. So I think I would challenge you also to put your centre in a systems thinking type point of view as well with respect to the circular economy, because I think undoubtedly you all know that it is part of a system of systems. It's about technology, it's about behaviours. I do wonder also whether we can get an economic advantage from approaches towards this as well. As a business department, I'm virtually obliged to say that in passing. So science is absolutely core to the delivery of a vision of net zero and the circular economy. I think, and you've seen pictures like this already this morning, I think we can think of a circular economy as an industrial system that is restorative by design. This is some work done by EPSRC and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that you're probably familiar with, looking at the minerals manufacturing cycle on one side, but the renewable energy and power side on the other, and thinking about how to get those to couple. And in a way, it's, to my point, a little bit around a systems of systems approach. I think my one final comment about science before I finish the talk is also the role that digital twins can play in this. And this, I think, is a very nice example. And I think it took the mental health service. I quite like that from the last talk, but I guess it's the same idea as the mental health service in some senses. Can we have digital twins that enable this? It's again an example from the EPSRC portfolio, where the digital twins learn about the performance here of a battery, and therefore we can understand how to reuse that in a way. I think that harnessing of the digital understanding alongside also the functional understanding of these materials is really, really important. I guess that's the concept in the mental health service that we just heard about. So really kind of bring these sort of ideas together. Digital is a key part, in my mind, of that. Just one more final comment on the sustainable supply from recycling. I think this is a graph that I was shown last week that struck me around the primary and secondary use of this is just of batteries and the recycling gap that arise from that. So there is a time lag in that system as well. So I think we've got to understand and be realistic about what we can achieve with elements of the circular economy versus the primary production of materials and the time lags that will be inherent in the system as part of that. And again, I think it's trying to understand that systems approach and that sustainability alongside that circular elements of a recycling economy. So hopefully that kind of big picture perspective down from net zero down to the circular economy provides a perspective that I hope the centre will be able to respond to. I think, as I said, achieving net zero and mitigating climate change will require this kind of systems approach. We will require increasing resource and material efficiency to drive that circular economy. And I absolutely believe that science is critical to this, a combination of the research and development, the technology and the behavioural sciences that will be needed to pull together this transition to net zero. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I've already tweeted about your launch today, which I wish you all the success with this centre, which is very, very much needed and very much an important area of trying to achieve the challenges of net zero and those of the circular economy. Thank you very much indeed.
That was Professor Paul Monks, and thank you very much for that talk, Chief Scientific Officer to the government. Next up, we have Chris MacDonald, CEO of the Materials Processing Institute, and he will be discussing the circular economy as an opportunity for the UK metals sector. So I'd like to hand over to Chris MacDonald.
Thank you, Mark. And it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'd like to also thank Professor Fan and the team at Brunel for inviting me to speak to launch this really, I think, vitally important new UKRI interdisciplinary centre for circular economy and metals. Now, my background's in steel, and in fact, I've spent my entire career working in the metals sector. And during that time, I've had the great pleasure to get to know Professor Fan and to appreciate the tenacity with which he's built a great capability at Brunel, which started first in light metals and is now focusing on the circular economy. And so I think all of us who are active in metals technology and research in industry, as I am, are grateful to Professor Fan and to Brunel and UKRI for their ongoing commitment to research in this really vital area. Now, as Mark's just mentioned, I'm the Chief Executive of the Materials Processing Institute, which is the UK's national centre for the development and scale-up of new technologies for the steel and metal sector. At the Institute, we have 4 areas of research interest: advanced materials, digital technologies, industrial decarbonisation, and of course, the circular economy. And as we've just heard from Professor Monks, it's possible to combine some of these things together. So as we look at decarbonisation, the circular economy, we can also see how advanced digital technologies can enable that. Now, just as Professor Fan and his colleagues carry out fundamental early stage development activity, it's our job at the Materials Processing Institute to do the upscaling innovation, the commercialisation that brings this great investment in research through to its economic potential in industry. To support this, the Institute was recently awarded £22 million of funding by the government through Innovate UK, which is part of UKRI, to support the UK steel and metal sector. And this is now available for us to work with UK-based companies. So in this way, this new centre for the circular economy fills a vital gap in national capability by building on our existing strong relationship and working together. So Brunel and the Materials Processing Institute combined represent a really powerful set of capabilities that will enable us as a United Kingdom economy to take research ideas all the way from a fundamental stage right through development and application in partnership with industry as never before. Now, I'm also the chair of the UK Metals Council, and this is the body that links 11,000 or so businesses in the UK metals sector directly with government and with one another.
In this role, I've seen just how important an industrial sector metals is to the UK. The industry directly employs 250,000 people, with another 750,000 relying on it. The sector makes a contribution of almost £11 billion per year in GDP, and yet very few metals industry companies are household names. There are two reasons for this. First, many businesses in the sector are small businesses. They're important in their local communities. They may have highly specialised processes such as advanced casting, forming or coating, but they rarely garner national attention. The second reason is that metals businesses are vital linchpins in our industrial supply chains, but they don't make consumer products. Instead, they make the materials or the components from which household names make their products. And it's for this reason that the health and sustainability of the UK metal sector is vital for our advanced engineering, rail, aerospace, and automotive sectors. The green industrial revolution, as we have heard, will be built on metals-intensive technologies, such as offshore wind, nuclear electric vehicles, and more. So why is it then that a circular economy centre is so vitally important to the UK metals industry, and as a consequence, to the UK economy as a whole? Well, there are several clear reasons why the circular economy presents a major opportunity for the UK metal sector. The first and perhaps most apparent is one of environmental sustainability and resource efficiency that meets Britain's ambition to be a global leader in decarbonising technologies, and where my institute is also thinking in terms of our role to support the UK's hosting of COP26 in Glasgow later this year. Utilising recycled metal means that less virgin ore needs to be mined. This much is obvious. And it creates an environmental benefit at the mine. But there is also an environmental benefit from the processing, with less energy generally required for recycling rather than smelting and refining. But this does present a series of research questions that need to be answered around the recyclability of different metals, the technologies for sorting and separation, as well as an understanding of the product and applications performance, where products are made from recycled materials as compared with virgin ore. There's a second opportunity in the reduction of mining, in that some metals are sourced from locations around the world where the proceeds of the mining industry are used to prop up undemocratic and exploitative regimes, where workers are poorly treated, child labour blights the lives of millions, and modern slavery also persists. For too long, Western consumers have been able to turn a blind eye to the consumption of materials produced overseas in ways that would not be acceptable at home. A circular economy approach gives the opportunity for consumer and producer choice and competition, with the opportunity to drive up ethical standards and the working conditions in the materials supply chain. This reduction in our reliance on international material supply chains is also an important consideration for our sovereign security and capability. At times of increasing geopolitical tensions, and with the security of material supply seen as vital to national interest, it's worrying to see how many metals vital for our future are now listed as having a supply risk. If anyone doubts the vulnerability here, we saw recently with the blockage of the Suez Canal how quickly international supply chains can empty as just-in-time deliveries dry up. Investing more in our circular economy will provide a degree of resilience to UK manufacturing and infrastructure projects, as well as reducing our political dependence on interests that dominate the production of certain metals. Increasing the circularity of metals is also vital for delivering the green industrial revolution. New green technologies, whether for electrification, energy generation, or associated infrastructure, all need metals. It's also true that as we seek to eliminate carbon emissions, not only are we investing in renewing our manufacturing base and adding new infrastructure, but there's a strong environmental case for metals to be favoured above other materials, such as cement, for instance, where this is possible. As a consequence, the drive to eliminate carbon, whilst it might result in greater materials efficiency in the long term, will also result in a short-term surge in materials demand and a greater shift towards metals within that. Where metals will have a challenge is ensuring the recyclability of ever more exotic alloys, to create the properties for new green applications for stronger, lighter, more conductive, more hard-wearing metals, or with enhanced coatings. Again, this is an important area of opportunity for the UK metal sector and presents a vital set of research questions for the new Circular Economy Centre to address. My final point on the benefits to the metals industry in achieving a circular economy approach is that in going green, we inevitably need to go smart too. The UK economy as a whole has stagnating levels of productivity since the financial crisis, but we're now seeing the emerging new digital technologies of the fourth industrial revolution moving out of the laboratory and on to the factory floor. Investing in a circular economy approach within the sector gives us the opportunity to simultaneously invest in automation and new ways of working. So go smart and go green at the same time, driving up productivity and increasing the sustainability of the sector and the jobs and the communities that rely on it. It can be understood from these areas of supply chain security, sustainability and ethics, increasing productivity and achieving a green industrial revolution, that the opportunity for the circular economy is of direct benefit to the metal sector, but also presents far-reaching opportunities for the wider UK. It is, though, useful to understand that this country, the UK, is almost uniquely placed to benefit from this circular economy approach. Having been at times the most industrialised nation on earth and having retained a strong manufacturing economy with advanced supply chains, this means that we have an abundance of available raw materials combined with the industrial base capable of utilising it. We must also recognise that to make this a success will require our talented researchers, engineers, industrialists and innovators at centres such as this, at my own institute, and in our excellent foundries, forges and furnaces throughout the whole of the UK. It's by working together in partnerships, such as those represented by this centre, that we can reap the benefits in industry, in developing key technologies for the future, in our communities and environmentally, of a circular economy approach to metals. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you're interested in what I've got to say, I've got a YouTube channel where I've posted a number of videos around the circular economy. You can find that quite easily, hopefully. Thank you once again to Mark and to Professor Fan, and I wish you the best of luck in the formation of this new centre.
Thank you, Chris MacDonald. That was Chris MacDonald, CEO of the Materials Processing Institute. And you are tuned in to the launch of the Centre for Circular here as part of the NICER programme today. We're showing you a series of presentations that were at our first launch earlier in May. And the last of those presentations is now coming up. And it's really where we get into the details of the research that we're carrying out. And so we are going to hear from the co-Is, not all of them, but 3 co-Is, Professor Brian Cantor, representing Brunel, Jan Godsell from Warwick, and Raymond Bleichwitz from UCL, who will give an overview of the circular metals research that we're going to be carrying out. And then we're going to go into some question and answers after that, which will become a live part of today's program. Okay, so handing over to my co-Is.
Good. Well, hi, everybody. Great to see you all. Well, I can't see you all, but great that you're all here, and perhaps you can see a small picture of me. My name is Brian Cantor, as has already been said. I'm a senior advisor at BCAST at Brunel University London. I'm also deputy director of the new UKRI Centre for Research, Interdisciplinary Research in Circular Metals, or to give it a short name, as Professor Fan pointed out, Circular Metal. I'm going to talk about the technology aspect. So there's 2 overarching points. First, the first one is to say that we have 3 broad strands of research. There's the technological development. This was somewhat prefigured in what Paul Monk said. We have the technology developments. He pointed out we can't cope with technology development alone, but we can't cope without it either. So there's technology development, there's development of business models and supply chains, and there's development of macroeconomics and socioeconomic activity by people. And so my two colleagues will talk about those latter two things after I've talked about the technology developments. The second overarching point is this, and it's come up a lot in the chat room. But it was just said by Mark, we're open to collaboration. We've got a significant sum of money, but way below what's needed to do what we need to do for this enormously important field. I'm going to say a few words about a few of our initial research work packages. It's only a selection of them. It's only to give you a flavour, and I'll say a few words about them. But we have more than this, but it's still nowhere enough. We are open to collaboration with everybody. So please contact us, because we intend to use the centre as a seed calling activity to initiate a lot of other research. And this whole launch is designed to get people to contact us so we can build more research. So let me go through some of the research we are launching with, just some elements of it. Here are some of the work packages. Multi-component alloys has already been mentioned by Professor Fan. Rationalization of steel and alumina alloy grades, using grain refiners to be able to use casting as opposed to wrought alloys, which involves less use of less material. Rejuvenation, of course, of materials. That's a little bit like the health service idea that Professor Fan mentioned. We've got some specific projects on, in this case, remanufacturing the big steel components used in heavy goods vehicles. Advanced sorting of scrap, already mentioned by Chris MacDonald. And of course, with the massive growth there's going to be already is and will be even more so in electric vehicles, new types of scrap and new needs to use scrap. So those are some of the elements. I'm going to go through them, some of these in a little bit more detail, but not very much. I'm not going to talk through these slides because there's not far too much to talk about. Just to give you a little bit more of a flavour, and please follow up. Get in touch with us if you're interested in these things or things which are in the interstices between them. So, as Mark already said, I was involved in inventing the field of multi-principal elements, and there are two people who invented it independently some time ago. And it's been discovered now that if you have alloys with large numbers of alloying elements in them, which we've never done before, then they are resilient to adding even more alloying elements. And you get even better properties than conventional alloys if you tailor them right. So we have a particular project here to apply this to recycling, which, by the way, was thought about 20 years ago when this field started, but has hardly been taken forward by anybody. We also have at BCAST lots of new technology recently developed by Professor Fan and his colleagues for how to control the nucleation during certification. We're going to need to use more casting, partly to replace raw products because that uses less material, but we need to get better quality castings, but also because we need to recycle. And when we recycle, we don't want to recycle back to the smelter and treat our recycled scrap as just on a par with new ore. We want to, if we can just remelt it, that's a lot better. And the new methods of controlling the nucleation to keep the grain size small and to control the nucleation of undesirable intermetallic compounds is critical, and the wherewithal to do that has been developed where it needs to be applied. This is the health service idea that Professor Fan talked about. So we can use advanced monitoring and measuring techniques, sensors, to detect as fatigue cracks grow and develop in a material. This is rather like health monitoring that's already used in a number of places, notably aerospace industry, to monitor components, but this is at the materials level. So we can use advanced sensors to monitor the performance of material, detect it's beginning to change, and use advanced rejuvenation methods to heal it. In many cases, perhaps in situ, but certainly demounting it and replacing and/or rejuvenating it much more quickly. Similar sort of thing here. Here's a specific case of doing this with heavy-duty goods vehicles, where there's a project to take these with industrial partners and take the big steel components in this and use, again, advanced sensoring, advanced lifing methods to be able to rejuvenate, remanufacture, reuse these very large amounts of steel much more effectively. And we're going to develop computer-based vision systems for monitoring and for sorting, as well as the system management of scrap. And here are two last ones, which are about using, again, the same kind of thing in specific cases. Electric vehicles are beginning to use, this is the first time that extrusion, rolled sheet, and cast scrap has all been merged together. To do this for electric vehicle usage, to do this, you need to have, again, advanced sensing, you need to have advanced sorting, you need to have new alloy formulations so that you can do it. And a similar sort of thing in the aerospace industry for the alloy Aramet A20, using, again, a newly invented method of melt conditioning, using shearing to make sure you can get the right sorts of structure. So that's all from me, just a bit of a taster and a rapid run through, but we want your input. So please come and talk to us about those projects, contact us after the event, and also contact us if you've got lots of interesting things to do in between these, because there's an awful lot more things we can do, because we are meant to act as a centre for the growth of the community. Thanks a lot. Thanks,
Brian. That was Professor Brian Cantor talking to us through some of the metallurgy and research that will be undertaken in the centre. And now I want to hand over to Professor Jan Godsell, who's going to be talking about the circular business model research. Jan, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Matthew, are you sharing the slides, or do you want me to share my own?
If you can share them, that'd be great, please.
Okay. Just a moment. Okay, so I see that there's been some very interesting points made in the comments that actually speak to some of the work that we're doing within Work Package 3. And one of the great things about Fan, when he was reaching out to people about the project, was the inclusive way in which he looked at this. And for those of you reading the comments, there's lots of you talking about that it's not just about the technology or the materials, but that this may require different ways of actually thinking about how we do business. And so actually, one of the great things, again, about this particular work package around circular business is that it actually brings together the strengths of two universities, Brunel and WMG, to consider this issue from three interconnected perspectives. So we're going to look at circular business model innovation, which perhaps answers the question that we heard earlier from Mike, who's sort of saying, if we're going to make these things last longer, are they not going to be more expensive? So how are people going to be able to afford them? So part of the way that that's going to be made possible is through having different types of business models, perhaps using servitization or lease type models. But actually what we want to do is, with some work led by Fabrizio, supported by Alessio Franconi at Brunel, is to understand that full spectrum of different circular business models and how they can be applied. And then we saw, actually, I think it was a different mic, so there's lots of mics on our call today, who was then asking the questions about, but what does this mean for supply chain design? This gives us an opportunity to do things very differently. And indeed it does. And that's where my area of expertise comes into place. And we'll be looking at the ways in which we can align the product, the process, and the supply chain design to take that old principle of 3D concurrent engineering, but actually apply it to the circular economy, particularly in the metals industry. And then our colleague David Harrison from Brunel will then actually think about that in a lot more detail from a product perspective to actually pull out what those circular product design principles are. And so what you're going to see is a programme of work over the 4 years that answers a range of different research questions. So with that first package around business model innovation, we'll be answering questions such as, how can circular business models enable full metal circulation? What are those socio and technical barriers and drivers that could enable that successful transition? And how can these businesses be enabled by a range of those different design principles and tools to enable those circular business models to actually take place? From a supply chain perspective, we're going to be looking at those supply chain design principles. So this idea of 3D concurrent engineering, designing the product, process and supply chain simultaneously, is an old idea. And indeed, it absolutely pains me to see so many organisations just so focused on the product. And having a background in pharmaceuticals and working for Dyson in the early days, these were very, very product orientated organisations. Some think a little bit about the process, but there are very, very few organisations that think about their supply chain design from the outset. And so actually we think that in order to really make the breakthrough in terms of the circular economy, we do need to do that. And what we also need to understand is, therefore, if this is a really straightforward principle, why haven't people done it? So what are the barriers, drivers and enablers to adoption? And how can these actually help us to, by overcoming those, to accelerate the successful adoption of circular business models? And then last but not least, the sorts of research questions that we're looking to answer through the circular product design principles is to look at, if we want to align product, supply chain and process, what are the product design principles that we need to embed that are actually going to enable that to take place? And again, I think this is a common theme when you start to look at types of work where you actually want to drive change in the real world. You need to understand, again, those barriers and drivers, and also, again, this idea that we want to actually accelerate the adoption. So to bring these three sorts of work streams to life, what we're actually going to do is to work on 3 case studies. And what you'll see, you can see that big JCB at the front there. So what you can also tell is that we're going to dovetail nicely into our colleagues that are working on the more technical work packages, and also our colleagues from UCL. I'm just about to hand over to Raymond in a moment, who perhaps are working at the more economic and social orientated work packages. But we're looking at 3 different sectors that we think show the full range of what we'd say is the sort of product process choice matrix. So on one end, we've got fast moving consumer goods that are high volume, relatively low variety, and actually do get directly into the hands of the consumer. In the mid sort of range, we've got yellow goods, the likes of a JCB, and at the other end of the spectrum, where we've got very, very high variety but low volume, we have the construction industry. And by actually working on real life case studies in these sectors, we will bring the research questions that I've just presented to life. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jan. That was Professor Jan Godsell on our circular business model research. And as she alluded to, now that it's working in collaboration across universities, this centre. And I'm going to hand over to Professor Raymond Bleichwitz, who is going to talk about the circular macroeconomics modelling and research being carried out. Professor Bleichwitz is Director of the Bartlett School of Environment and Energy and Resources at UCL, and he is Chair in Sustainable Global Resources at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources. Raymond, over to you.
Well, thanks, Mark, for your very kind introduction. It's also glad to see like 2 UCL people, at least now for a few minutes, being here on the screen. Raymond Bleichwitz, Chair in Sustainable Global Resources and Director of the Bartlett School. So I thought what I could share here feeds into what we have discussed over the morning, and you probably can see my slide now, right? So it is very much about the idea.
It doesn't look quite like it's filling the screen.
All right, I can definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, there we are. Maybe it's not exactly the. Okay, let me just go ahead, because you see something, and you can indeed also just listen for a minute here, because it is just this one slide, and the main topic is the question about economic advantages and for whom. So we are impressed by what we heard before, the relevance of the UK metals industry with like over 11,000 companies, and underpinning as a foundation industry roughly 200 billion of the UK GDP. So it is quite a relevant part as a foundation industry. And in order to understand in this system thinking spirit that we just heard, what happens if this component of a larger system becomes more circular, what happens with the other parts? We thought we really need to do some macroeconomic analysis. And that is also playing into the larger embeddedness of the UK economy in the globalized world, where indeed metals chain are so vital, because the larger share of metals is being imported in the UK, and there's a rather tiny share that is being exported. So you could, for instance, look at the share of metals that is globally imported, that is imported into the UK, and then compare it with the export of scrap steel. And the ratio is roughly 1 to 10. So really an enormous amount of metals being imported and a rather low share that is being exported, for instance, as scrap steel. And that was one of the questions that was also raised in the chat. And indeed, I can also alert here anyone who is interested to Chatham's House Resource Database. When Fan asked me to share this consortium here, I was really impressed and felt inspired by his vision of circular metals. The question therefore really is, that comes from me as an economist to our friends and colleagues from metallurgy and technology, what happens on the markets if high quality materials can be produced via reuse and repurposing, via liquid metals and other means? How would we then boost the markets for circular economy metals, and how could we produce value, and what would happen in the larger areas that are underpinned, plus on the global side, if there is a reduction in demand for resources, if there is a larger dematerialization eventually, or indeed, if the extractive economies from today will not be able or will be less in demand with their extracted commodities in the future. So all these are larger economic repercussions. What we will do as part of this project here is that we will look more into the pricing of metals. And here's a question I would like to raise. It leads into the panel discussion that we have in a minute. Are the prices for metals higher or lower than 10 years ago? We'll answer it. So one of the activities that we will undertake is to investigate more into the development and the drivers for prices for metals in the UK and internationally. We will be hiring a PhD student who joins us from China to also undertake a bit more analysis that looks into this very pivotal market for the globalized metals economy and look into like how metals are being processed in China. And the probably interesting piece that we try to bring in here is a macroeconomic model. That is what you need when you need to look at the winners and losers, the size of the cake, and the expected gains for the UK economy under different scenarios. The model that we have developed, and we, that is, well, two more people from UCL who are with us here today, Matthew Winning and Alvaro Calzadilla. There's a model called UCL Engaged that is based on updated input-output tables. It has a global representation. It has global commodity trade in it. And it has also all the extensions that are needed into environmental accounts, in particular carbon, but also other environmental data in it. It is what the economists call a global a computable general equilibrium model, and fortunately it has been established over the last 5 years. We did a paper that I can share in a minute about steel and what would happen if the largest steel producer in the world, which is China, would shift into using more scrap steel over the next decades. And guess what? Even China would benefit despite indeed a decline in the primary steel production. And the rest of the world, as a majority, would benefit from it because there will be more a supply of steel in the market. So that is but one example of the type of work that you could do with the sake of a macroeconomic model, all indeed open to conversations about some of the assumptions, some of the equations, and indeed the scenarios that we would like to develop together with the people here. And then thirdly, we will also have a stream of analysis on the role of society, the role of consumers, public awareness. I may wave my hand here to Mark Miodovnik, who will have the pleasure of leading this part of the work on behalf of UCL. I'm stopping here. I think the main part will also then lead into all the broader conversations that we'll have, not just about a circular economy with Fiona, with the hub, with the 4 other centers, but also what we learn is indeed the main mission of the UK for the next years, the net zero carbon agenda, and the role that a hard-to-abate sector like the metal industry might and should be able to play. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Raymond, and thank Brian and Jan. That's excellent. And I would like now to invite them. Those were pre-recorded from our launch in early May. I'd like to invite Brian, Raymond, and Jan onto the stage for the live. Yes, the live question and answer. You've been waiting for it, and now here it is. And I'd also like to invite Professor Scammons and Professor Davis and Professor Harrison, also co-Is. And you haven't met them yet in this launch, but let me just tell you a little bit about them. Professor Geoffrey Scammons is Professor of Metallurgy at Brunel University and the Chief Scientific Officer of Innovel Technology Limited. Claire Davis is the Royal Academy of Engineering and Tata Steel Professor of Low Energy Steel Production. And Professor David Harrison is a Professor of Design Research at Brunel University at the Interdisciplinary Centre for Circular Metals, which is this centre. And here we are. Here I can see everyone's faces. And what we'd like to do now is open up the discussion with the wider community now, question and answers. And we've got quite a lot of questions in the Q&A chat, which I'm going to start with. And then perhaps we can move, this might initiate more questions, or we might move to some more general questions. So I can see that Christine Scharf has been asking lots of questions. David Peck has been asking lots of questions, and Catherine Adams. And if I may, I will start with Catherine's question to the panel, which is as follows. Some industries, such as automotive, are very much geared towards lean production, just-in-time production for assembly. And this rarely includes the circular economy in terms of remanufacture, longevity, and being able to disassemble components. This means that they go down the lowest recovery application, recycling, often downcycling. There isn't much reuse, or I think she hasn't said this, design for repair. I don't know who would like to take that question. It seems to me a design question.
If I could start.
Yes, go ahead.
So I think this perhaps me and then David. So I'd argue maybe it starts beyond design, before design actually, with the business model. So for instance, some of the trade-offs, for instance, that an automotive company may need to make is, are they better? So this will link into David, to design today so that it's low weight. But actually in doing so, you may use a composite material that's difficult to do anything with at end of life. Or do you take a slightly higher weight today, knowing that then the part could potentially be remanufactured and reused? And some of the tools and techniques don't necessarily exist at the moment to be able to make some of those trade-offs. But also the business models don't necessarily exist to support those different ways of thinking about things. And there's also some human dimensions here, because as humans, we still tend to value newness over utility. So I may go to the CEX shop to buy my son an Xbox, even though it's not that much cheaper than buying it brand new, but I'm guaranteed the use for 2 years. So for a marginally lower cost, I get 2 years of utility, whereas a brand new one, I may only get 1 year of utility. But actually, consumer-based research still shows that we as humans tend to prefer newness to utility. And so it may require a change in business models that sort of decouples that newness from the utility, which will then enable, hopefully David can come on to explain some of those different design considerations that can better support this. I would hope that this is some of the things that we will explore during Work Package 3. And it's one of the great benefits, I think, of the way that we all helped bring together this project.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, that's a great starting point for the answer to this. I mean, unpicking the complexity that is both social in terms of attitudes, all the way through to business models and supply chains. And this and the shift for all sorts of products is bound to have all these factors involved. Raymond, you've got your hand up. I think, is David also wanting to talk on this? Raymond, you go, and then we'll go over to David. Is that okay?
I just think that this example is really stunning, because there's also a large material leakage in the UK and many other countries through the exports of used cars. So it's not scrap steel, but used cars. And that is driven by a pricing mechanism where in many growing economies, the price for a used car is higher than in the UK because there is a limited supply of fresh brand cars. And that is driving all the exports. That doesn't necessarily mean that the lifetime there is longer. It doesn't necessarily mean there are proper recycling facilities. So it will be interesting on our side to look at the used car exports and target countries in our analysis on pricing, and then indeed figure out of how the lifetime can be extended and what it means for the future availability of secondary materials.
And Raymond, if I could just follow up on that before bringing David in, but do you see a role for policy here as well, government policy in terms of export, I guess, taxes perhaps, in order to encourage more reuse?
A policy is definitely yes. The immediate solutions sound rather strict, like export taxes, export restriction. I have difficulties to think of those solutions as really being viable. I would think more of partnerships with main target countries, like in Central Asia, and then indeed also industry being involved via principles of responsibility and accountability. But indeed, there's a range of policy options that we would like to consider and discuss with stakeholders and the attendants here.
Thanks, Raymond. I'll hand over to David now to take us from the design perspective.
Just a few thoughts, really. One is that traditionally there was quite a strong market in dismantled components in a sort of scrapyard sort of way, really. And I think that has declined. So to move back to that, then people need to think more about design for disassembly, and design for disassembly and design for assembly should really operate hand in hand. If you design the product well to be assembled, it should be easier to disassemble it as well. One of the other things that came up in the earlier talks about the digital twin, the technical possibilities of tracking components through their life, so you're more confident in your ability to reuse them, and they effectively have higher value for reuse, is another sort of technological opportunity. But it probably needs to be encouraged by legislation and a legislative framework, because otherwise it isn't going to happen, really. So that it becomes, it is economic, really, to let these design changes and opportunities take place and get adapted. That's about it, really. I think Claire probably had something she wanted to say.
Oh, Claire, yes. Do come in on that.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I mean, it's really just to pick up on this being an extremely important area and one that we are going to be tackling within the project. And so I think this is where the advantage of being able to link through to the supply chain and the economics, as well as then the technical side of things that various of us will be working on. And the idea of the disassembly is essential, but also then the understanding of loading environments and therefore what the end of first life, residual life is for a component. So you can then design how you would use that in subsequent reassembly and the reuse scenario. And that's where we also link through into some of the other areas of technical work for rejuvenation, where we can try and then increase the residual life in the component, so you have a lot of confidence when we go into reuse and remanufacture. And I think this is where the hub has an advantage in being able to weave these elements together, and we can take the case studies to see how that will develop for a much more circular use of the materials. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And I see that Brian's got his hand up to also add something to this. And then also I'll go over to David Peck's question, which I think follows on. But Brian, go ahead.
Well, I think I'm going to re-emphasise the point that Claire just made, but in a slightly different way. Paul Monk said that technology can't do it alone, and then in the pre-recorded presentation, and I said in the pre-recorded presentation, but we can't do it without technology. And I think the question asked is a fantastic, brings that out fantastically well. We're going to have to do this in all sorts of different things. So automobiles are one example. An awful lot of metal is used in automobiles, and the creation of the metals that underpin it, the components that go into it, and then the cars themselves. And so enormous amounts of that CO2 we produce and that energy we use, which we want to reduce, is associated with the automobile sector. But the same is true to take a completely different example of the of cans for food and drink. You know, it's another enormous sector which is totally dependent upon the use of metals. And there's a whole series of stages. Now, we're not going to solve the problems in either of those two big industries, and we have to solve the problems in both of those industries without making technological advances in better metals, which can be recycled, which can be reused, which can be reshaped, in having new designs which can use those metals, and in having different business models and supply chains which will therefore facilitate those being implemented. And that will require, as David just said, a legislative and a sort of social structure, legislative and framework. The government has a role to play, social behaviour has a role to play, which will therefore provide a pricing framework and an economic framework within which those new business models and those new technologies can be introduced. That's what this centre is all about. It's about linking all the way through that. So we're going to have to make developments in each of those things independently and then weld them together somehow so they all work.
Thank you, Brian. And I think you brought up an important point, which Jan in her talk also mentioned, which is that there's, you know, it's not going to be the same approach for each of the sectors, arguably, right? Because in the kind of fast-moving goods where you've got packaging applications, yeah, recycling is obviously is probably going to push ahead. And this is coming to David Peck's question, which is, you know, what is this balance between design for recycling and design for reuse or extended lifetime? And then if you go to cars, you know, the more high-value goods, you know, it may be that design for reuse and recycling, or it looks certainly that is a better way to cut CO2 emissions associated with these. But then when you go to the manufacturers, and we haven't got representation on the Q&A here, but we have in the project, and so you know, I think maybe one of our co-Is can talk for them, let's say. But what I hear is that it's part of this newness thing. People want newness, but it's also part of, they don't want their hands tied in terms of innovation. If you say to them design for component reuse, they start worrying that they won't be able to design, you know, they won't be able to design new features into their products. And this reluctance, I think, from industry to want to have their hands tied to make components across a board sector reusable seems to me to be a bit of a problem. I don't know if anyone wants to address that. It's kind of at the heart of David Peck's question too, which is product extension lifespan.
I comment on this.
Start.
Oh, sorry, Jan.
Sorry, you go first, Claire, and I'll build after you.
Thank you. I think it's also about how we look at what we mean by remanufacture and reuse. It doesn't have to be the same component. It may be that we reuse 90% of a particular component. So, for example, in some of the work that Sumit Hazra, who's working with me, is going to be looking at for some of the heavy goods vehicles, it'll be about considering chassis frames and, you know, what fraction of that can be reused, but it may be reused in a different chassis frame because you don't want to be constrained. And I think that, you know, Mark, that's absolutely right. It's not always about the constraint on the design, but it's reuse of material for the new designs.
Thanks, Claire. And Jan?
Yeah, so perhaps a slightly different perspective. So I think I alluded to earlier that actually at the moment, we don't necessarily have some of the tools that enable us to make some of those trade-offs. So we don't know whether it's better to actually recycle a component. I know when I go to Cuba and see the cars there that are 50 years old, and then I think, well, was it better to produce a car once for 50 years and they're still using really dirty engines? Or what would the carbon footprint have been if they produced a car every 3 years and replaced it under a personal ownership scheme, but actually they got a cleaner engine? You know, what's the difference between those two sort of approaches? So I think one of what we hope to be able to do through Work Package 3 is to start to look at a very old concept of 3D concurrent engineering, which always suggested that we should be designing a product, a process and a supply chain concurrently, where we very much know that many organisations focused predominantly on the product design, perhaps a little bit about the process, but very rarely on the supply chain. But actually what we need to start doing is not just doing that for the linear chain, we need to do that for the circular economy, i.e., and it perhaps comes back to what David said, we seem to have lost some of our ability. So rather than seeing it as a constraint, perhaps organisations should see it as an innovation opportunity to try to design things within common or standard platforms. And perhaps morally, it will become something, so coming back against some of that social dimension that actually companies are rewarded for, because as consumers, we may be able to start to see how those common platforms enable us to achieve some of our bigger goals towards net zero.
Thanks, Jan. I'm going to move on to some. Oh no, Raymond says he wants to. Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Raymond.
But just for the sake of keeping the discussion alive from my perspective, I think there's also indeed the trade-off that Jen has just mentioned between the lifetime and the sort of efficiency and modernization. But we may also look at a more intensive use rather than necessarily an extended lifetime. With a car, for instance, you could think of driving it 200, 300, maybe 500,000 kilometers, but in a lifetime that is shorter because it is more intensively used with car sharing, etc. So you would have a value proposition of a high value car that is intensively used. That means like there's a lot of, say, mobility as a service, while at the same time you would have an estimate that the materials can be recovered in a foreseeable time frame, and thereby indeed business models of reuse, recapturing those materials could also be applied different to thinking of them in like 50 years, where you have all sorts of liability question, how the business will actually survive in those 50 years. So the intensity of use might also be one that is interesting, and indeed it feeds into what we will certainly discuss and learn with Claire and Jan about what business models would then emerge and how the macroeconomic impacts would be.
Raymond, on that, I mean, I'm going to come to Brian because I can see he's got his hand up, but on that, is that a per mile? Do you foresee business models of a per mile then? I mean, that's the logic, right? You know, you start to design for a certain number of miles traveled rather than a...
Yes, of course. And also with a goal of having them less idle than they're currently, which means less need for parking space, and eventually also a lower number of cars, because the cars are more intensively used and shared with like service per mile approach.
Yeah. The future with from a business models perspective is certainly towards more servitized business models, but also they have the secondary benefit, which if you don't own the car, but the car is being shared, that issue around newness disappears, because actually the service provider is probably much less concerned about the newness of individual components than perhaps somebody would be if they actually, you know, if it's their car that's their pride and joy. And so potentially it does make it easier, just going back to David's question earlier, to potentially be able to, within the upkeep of those servitized vehicles, to be able to look at more circular approaches to maintaining them on the road.
Thanks, Jan. And Brian, over to you.
Yeah, I want to actually just initially to slightly reply to some other questions in the chat room. I think Bascard has asked how much metal is recycled. So, but just to underpin an extension of what Jan was talking about there, and what the area we got into, but just to underpin it, let's just realise something like 90% of all metal is aluminium and steel, and 50% roughly of both of those are recycled. A bit less out in the less developed economies, and a bit more in the developed, but roughly 50%. And metals have been somewhat left out because people think they're recycled. Despite that, metals and the industries associated with them produce something like 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions and all energy consumption and so on, because they're very heavy industries. And because when we recycle, even though we recycle 50%, most of it goes back to the smelter. And most of the energy use and most of the CO2 production is, the smelting's important, of course it is. That's a big producer, but so are all the subsequent shaping processes, the forging and the turning things into cars and all the rest of it. So now, we are not going to reach our targets as a country, as a world, to save the planet without doing something about that and reducing it dramatically. We've got to, as someone else has asked the question, you know, what are our targets? We've got to not be extracting much metal in the future. Only special cases where we need them, you know, for special purposes. And there will be some need for new metal, but it'll have to be reduced to very, very small. So somehow, almost all metal has to end up either being recycled, and recycled won't do it. It's got to be reused, reshaped, have life extension. All of those things have to happen. That's the most important thing to understand in this. We need to put, you know, whole businesses out of business almost, just like it's not just the energy companies that are going to have to completely change their model. So are the mining companies. They're not going to be able to continue, or we're going to fail. So we have to advance on all these fronts together. And where it locks into what's been said, what's been talked about before, is there are industries where the changed business model has led to completely different ways of working. And that's true, particularly in the aero engine industry, where most aero engine companies do not sell aero engines to the airplane, to the airway companies. They sell power. And you buy the power and they replace the aero engine to give you extended lifetimes. So suddenly the producer has a vested interest in extending the lifetime because they sold you a certain amount of power, and if they can make their engines last longer, then they save money. So we have to have those different business models, and we need government intervention in many of these industries to provide the sort of incentives that will make companies want to do that.
Thanks, Brian. And I guess I want to bring in Professor Fan, because there's a lot of questions in the, well, Christine is asking about sort of, you know, how we make things more recyclable, you know, because, you know, the complexity, she talks about composites, but I think she might mean alloys. Do you want to say something about, you know, that side of the centre's work, the kind of the metallurgy side, designing for more recyclable? And we've talked about reuse and extension lifespan, but ultimately we are going to have to make the alloys more recyclable and easier to recycle.
Thank you, Mark. I think listening to all the answers to questions, I think it's very, very, very interesting overall. And I start with recycling. Before I talk about recycling, I want to say one very important thing. I think circular economy is about a way of thinking. We need to think multiple factors as a thinking by systems rather than a single factor. For example, recycling is just one of the approach. And we talked about reuse, extension of life, and all this. Okay. But this is a real multiple factor problem. And I always believe, I think the government policy, regulations comes first because they can impose things into and onto the companies, onto the society, so that we start from here. So that's very effective to start with. And the business models were earlier already debated. Okay? And people mentioned about usage of cars, which is about currently, I think 92% of the time, on average, all the cars idle, parked somewhere at home or in a car park. So it's very little usage there. Only changing business model, you can see how effective, how much metals can be saved, and just current metals. And then without talking about, we see we're going to develop recycle-friendly metals. The other ones are much higher performance alloys for future. We see multi-component alloys. We have mentioned so many times here. And with all this, and which brings another fact dimension, the timing. And for such economy, we need to see, okay, recycling is current. And in the future, we see significant reduction of metal usage and CO2 reduction. It's going to be longer future. And we need to start with all this, everything we talk have to give a time scale, okay? So we'll come back to recycle here. And I think recycle currently is a current problem. The current problem, I think it's not even a technology problem. I think it's a society problem. How are we going to treat the metals we'll be dealing with or we are using, okay? And I see this as a societal problem because in terms of technology and the current recycling, for example, the metals used in cars, and they collect the scrap car and gobbled up with a huge machine into small pieces. And all those metals separated from other things, and eventually end up with aluminum. And now aluminum is contaminated. You can see the contamination is not largely from from the previous usage. It's from technology we use. That's actually poses a problem. How we do recycle? Are we really recycling, for example? So I just stop here because so many people want to talk about it.
There's a lot to say. And of course, this is just the flavor of our center that we're going to be developing over the next 4 years. So this is great to see so many different themes coming through. I mean, there is this question from Bhaskar about how many recycled, I mean, just taking on from that, how many recycled metals are used in the UK? I think we're talking about steel and aluminium and what our targets are. And David Peck is also asking about targets. Netherlands has proposed that we move to 50% less primary materials by 2030. And that means that we have to have targets to get to those types of numbers. Yeah, Jeff, you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, there's some very interesting figures just came out yesterday on this. This is from the aluminium side rather than the steel side, but it turns out that in 2019, 20 million tons of end-of-life aluminium was recycled, which is a huge amount. It could do. You could make a huge number of cars or an incredible number of cans from that. It could really satisfy a large proportion of what's going into cans and cars at the moment as two really major markets. Of course, it's not all the right alloy, and it's not all nicely segregated. So there's a huge amount of work to do on actually making sure that we do the best job we can in separating the streams. But there's a huge resource, and particularly in the UK, where we don't actually make almost any primary aluminium. So it's a particular problem in the UK because we don't have aluminium as a primary resource except for a very small production facility in Scotland. So it's intensely important for the UK to actually look after its aluminium scrap, to never export it, and to actually use it as our primary resource. It's just absolutely critical. So it's just a fantastic opportunity for the UK because we've already shut down nearly all our primary aluminium manufacture, and we just can't rely on bringing all our products in from other countries because all we're doing is importing embodied carbon, and we just should not be doing that. We should be using our recycled materials as a primary resource. Once we've managed to solve all the other issues of actually getting the right materials, extending their life, etc., and all the other good things, but really our primary resource should be our recycled scrap, whether it's aluminium or steel.
Thanks, Jeff. And what do you, I mean, it's an opportunity there, but is energy cost going to be one of the limiting factors, do you think? As renewables are favored, so the energy costs might go up, and that therefore might be less favorable for those nascent industries dealing with recycling in the UK. Yeah, Jeff, then Raymond.
Okay, well, no, I think because but particularly for aluminium, again, sorry, I'll let Claire talk about steel, obviously, but on the aluminium side, aluminium is so energy intensive in its primary form, and so much less in energy intensity in its secondary form to bring back. And it's roughly 5% of the energy required, and there's just a huge opportunity because the energy requirement is so much lower to do that either using clean electricity as much as possible, or also tapping into the green hydrogen revolution for actually processes such as where you need a lot of heat, where you want to use gas, so you want to use hydrogen rather than natural gas. So yes, but it's all, everything's, in my view, everything's going in the right way, and we have such a wonderful opportunity to do things properly.
Great. Raymond, and then maybe I'll hand over to Claire on the hydrogen for steel. Raymond, go ahead.
Well, on the price rule, what matters definitely are the prices for electricity, because you need lots of electricity, and there are, well, numerous complaints from industry that electricity prices in the UK are higher than electricity prices of main competitors, including those with similar decarbonization agenda. So driving down the prices for clean electricity is on the agenda and needs to be considered one way or another. So that is definitely an issue. There was also a remark made by David Peck about reducing primary imports of primary metals or primary materials. What I would suggest is what matters is the material footprint. So we would not like to look at direct imports of primary materials only, but also at the imported goods and their production pathways, which is why the material footprint approach is relevant. And the data that we have seen from Leeds University, John Barrett and others suggest that actually the UK has not been able to reduce the material footprint over the last 20 years. So there's definitely an agenda when the UK wanted to increase the resource productivity and circularity, that it also would need to start addressing more straight with policy and business models, the reduction of material footprints over entire supply chains.
Thank you, Raymond. And Claire, did you want to say something about the fuel and hydrogen for steels?
Yes, certainly. There is a lot of work internationally on the use of hydrogen for steel making, because in theory it can give you zero carbon produced steel. And I think that at the moment the UK needs to learn from what is happening internationally. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. But the one important point with this is also where the hydrogen comes from. And do you have clean hydrogen to then make clean steel? And that then links into the whole discussion point on energy and clean energy that would feed into clean primary material production.
Thank you. I can see Brian's got his hand up there.
Yes, and the hardest bit of all of this is going to be the government and policy incentives. I mean, if you take the thing we were just talking about, the current situation is quite crazy. That we, as Jeff has pointed out, that we have all this scrap aluminium, and it's we want to be able to use it as a primary resource, but currently it's not desirable to do so because it's cheaper for people to. It appears that the business model makes people import primary aluminium for being made outside. So in the end, the government is going to have to, and there's a total, and to take another example, there's a total mistake at the centre of the government's overall policy. The government's very, to its credit, has put in some tremendous targets, and it's got a sort of plan on how to do it. It says we're going to make all electricity production clean by using solar and whatever, and then we're going to turn everything else into being electrically driven. So the electric car thing doesn't make any sense unless you make your electricity clean. So you've got to have clean electricity, but the drive to get to make clean electricity is putting the price of electricity up. Of course it is, because it's using more expensive methods. And as Raymond and I think Claire were just talking about, what we need to do is somehow get that electricity cheaper to drive the methods that will then come in. So at the moment, the government has the wherewithal to do that, but it doesn't have a joined-up policy. It's going to be very difficult getting joined-up government policy. Classically, I'm sure it's a yes minister. I think several yes minister episodes on this. Yes, that's like wishing for the stars, isn't it? Government doesn't do joined up very well, but we're going to have to find ways to do that, because at the moment it's not a joined up policy. Now, we're going to have to somehow develop policy initiatives for government, and research organizations are not very good at that, but we're going to have to develop methods of bringing new materials, new designs, method of new business models, and companies want to do this too, but they're not going to do it unless they can make money out of it. And the only way they can make money out of it is by having changed taxation, legal requirements, regulation. All those sorts of government levers are going to be, in the end, very critical. It's going to be very hard to work out how to get there.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, and I can't. There aren't many more questions being constantly added. And oh no, here's one from Norman. But can I just ask if yes, this is the Faraday a Smart Award from Norman Swindles. Okay, yeah, so this is about the machine readable identification of components. Yeah, thank you, Norman. And in fact, I think you've joined our mailing list, and these are exactly the kind of companies we want to partner with. And part of the conundrum and answer, I think, that Brian has just been highlighting is that we need to kind of knit together the community, and that is what this centre is all about. Doing fundamental research, but also knitting together these commercial companies like the one Norman is talking about, Faraday.co.uk, and making sure that we are in a coherent and concerted effort to achieve our aims. Has anyone got any final thoughts that they want to talk about before we stop in 3 minutes' time? Anything that they feel that we haven't touched on that is an important part of the problem? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Mark, can I just mention one, based on all the answers questions so far? That's very important factor is the conflict between free market economy and environmental protection, which in other words, we see circular economy. And the objects difference are almost opposite. And that's why we see we need a very strong government intervention, the policy and regulations to make the transition start. And that's my major point I want to make. Thank you.
And we have policy levers. I mean, we have partners from BASE. So this is going to be obviously one of the focuses of the centre, isn't it? To advise on policy interventions.
That's true. Okay,
well, maybe I'm looking around and not seeing anyone else wanting to say anything at this point. So maybe this is the point I want to thank everybody for being part of this panel. Everyone has just contributed so much, and I feel very proud to be associated and part of this centre. I think we're off to a great start, and what an amazing set of people, not just as part of the centre, but also we really want to reiterate that we want to collaborate. We want to collaborate with other universities, not just in the UK but globally, and other companies, again, not just in the UK but globally. And I'm now just going to switch gears to tell you about some opportunities to collaborate with us, which are funded by the NICER Centre. So I'm going to say thank you to all my panelists and go to the centre of this slide just to tell you a little bit about this. So yes, so what is being offered by the Centre for Circular Metals and the CE Hub is feasibility studies. So opportunity to undertake speculative or potentially high impact research to accelerate innovative solutions. So any of the problems that we've already highlighted, if that's your specialty and you want to bid for funding, please do so. And you can go to the NICER website to find out more, or you can come to us and ask us. Now, our website is www.circularmetal.co.uk, and we will encourage you, if your application is in the metals, particularly steel and aluminium, then we are the right place to come to. Please engage, maybe just have a conversation with us about whether the research that you're considering, where it fits and how it can be best described. We're looking for different scales, regional and place-based research. We're looking for new collaborations between sectors and disciplines. And we're particularly looking to involve early career professionals. And I say this really strongly, that these kind of grants are a really good way for early career professionals to forge their own new careers. Getting these kind of feasibility study proposal grants is a really good way of starting up a new area of research that you might not otherwise have had an enormous amount of track record in. And so we really encourage early career professionals to strike out. If you've got a good idea, you've got some good links with industry or government, please get in contact. Please think about applying for this. Yes, and I guess the other thing to say is that we want you to deliver a tangible piece of work with specific output, but this can be across the whole scope of our centre. So circular economy principles across scales, disciplines, and industrial sectors. So that is it. Yes, I've said the website. We have a mailing list. We do really want you to interact with us. and we do really want you to be part of future events. So if you sign up for our mailing list, you'll find out about our future events. I want to thank all our speakers, particularly all the co-Is and Professor Fan for getting us all together and making this all possible in the first place. I want to thank the NICER organization people who have done a brilliant job with the tech today. So thank you. You've all been great. Rebecca, Katie, Paul, thank you so much. I want to thank our own brilliant project manager, Kieran O'Shea. He's done so much work and is so organized and is so on the ball, and it's really, really helpful and wonderful to have you doing all this. It's really appreciated. And finally, I want to thank you all for attending our launch and for listening to us and for asking us questions, and looking forward to working with everyone in the future. So yes, that brings this event to a close, and thank you. See you at the next one.